Guy, would you like to come forward and the slides will appear. Our last speaker in this fantastic panel, I'm sure you can weave dung beetles in somehow, Guy. Don't you? No pressure. Has a history or background in agronomy and a deep understanding of soil health, microbiology and sustainable land management. He's the driving force behind SoilCQuest, and he's going to tell us, I'm pretty excited because you're going to talk about pimping the paddock today, I think. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you. Thanks, Guy.
Thanks very much. It's an honour to be the last speaker, so to have the final say for the day. Or I think, moreover, my job is to keep you awake probably a little bit more and get the energy levels going through to the good dinner that we're going to have tonight. For my 20 minutes that I'd like to pop my little bit of information into the bucket that's forming around how do we make Australian agriculture sustainable. I think a lot about how we get all these great ideas that we're already thinking about and we've already got, how do we get them to be adopted at scale, at speed? Because the timeline that we're up against is obviously demands that at scale, at speed bit. And I work at the coalface, so that's probably a bad term, but at the, out in the paddock and with the growers, and I'm getting a really clear sense of the level of adoption that we've got out there in general agriculture, in the peak of the bell curve, as they call it. So I thought it might be good, being the last speaker, to just ease the brain a little bit, tell it as a bit of a story, and I might weave a little bit of Australian culture into the story as we go through. But my story begins back in 1929 when my father was born, and I'm going to keep track of the carbon dioxide equivalents as we go through this presentation. Is this the thing I use, is it? We'll work out the technology, hey? So that green buttons go forward. Rightio. So Dad, Mick Webb, he was my mentor in agriculture in the early days. And back when he was born, 295 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we fast forward 36 years, a guy called Alexei Leonov, the Soviet cosmonaut, was the first man to walk in space. So technology was really starting to take off in 1965. Carbon dioxide levels had jumped up to 320 parts per million. In that same month, in December 1965, I was born. So I enter stage left, Guy Webb. I was really keen on soil from a very, very young age. My father was a pastoralist, and I learnt a lot about the soil at his hip, digging holes and strainer post holes and things like that. And he'd often pick up the peds and show me what they were doing. My mother was a very, very keen gardener, as well as a veggie gardener and an amateur botanist as well. So I had a really keen interest in soil from a very young age. And believe it or not, when I was 3 years old, I actually had to consume soil 3 times a day for my very life, or so my 8-year-old older brother told me at the time. So by the time 1975 rolls around, I'm 10 years old, and these groovers come on the scene, Angus Young and Bon Scott, and they're singing about dirty deeds. And I thought, hallelujah, a rock band singing about soil. How cool is that? I was really disappointed when I found out that, it was more about criminal activity than soil, that song. So I decided I'd actually rewrite the lyrics. And I would just wonder whether you'd indulge me if I sing that song to get a bit of energy in the room. I also want to know what a resonator guitar sounds like in the Shine Dome. So I don't know whether it's gone out of key in the last half hour, but we'll give it a go. Excuse me for the poor singing and even poorer playing, but you'll get the gist. Feel free to head bang if you want. Got a problem with climate change, giving you the blues. Not enough carbon in your soil. Here's what you've got to do. Get carbon having a home in the soil microaggregate zone. So you can store it for all time. CO2 back to 350, that's 350 parts per million atmospheric carbon dioxide. As your soil gets better all the time. Dirty deeds, done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds, done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds, done dirt cheap. Yeah, dirty deeds and they're done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds and they're done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds and they're done for a remarkably economical price. So in the context of what the alternative is if we don't do anything, doing something is a remarkably economical price of putting carbon in the soil. Not that those two guys knew it. So we fast forward a few years and I'm 18 years of age. Carbon dioxide levels have jumped up to 343 parts per million. And I leave school with an introduction to agriculture, which is the 82-83 drought, which was just an absolute screamer of a drought, and we saw Charlie talking about it early on. This wasn't from that era, but this is the more recent 18-19 drought, but it looked the same as that. So imagine, if you will, a landscape just completely denuded of all grass. We'd gone through and we'd scrub for the cattle. So we'd climb up those currajong trees and with a tomahawk or a home-light chainsaw and cut the limbs off and feed the cattle. And we'd done all the currajongs, all the rosewoods, all the wilga, all the casuarina on the property like that. They do grow back, but it looks really terrible. It looks like a denuded landscape. And we're surrounded by hills. And up in the hills grew these acacias, these small sort of what they call currawong. And about 9% protein. You could keep livestock alive on them, and that was all we had left. So I want to think, and I've got a... When I left home and left school rather, and this was my first job, was climbing currajong trees and cutting scrub for cattle. And just to keep the theme of a bit of culture coming in, since it's St. Patrick's Day, and to span a very wide cultural spectrum, I've got a bush ballad to read you. So, yeah, you're really in luck, aren't you? So this ballad, I think actually Rhonda, who's still in the audience here somewhere, she's actually heard it a few years ago, so it might ring a bell with you. But I penned it some years after this event happened. But as I read the ballad, it's just a funny story, but as I read the ballad, I want the context for you to think about is what's the educational, what's the financial, and what's the cultural lens and backdrop that's happening in this scene. So it's called My Dad, the Axeman Mick. Cutting scrub for cattle. It was summer in the drought of 83. Up on the foothills where the currawong grew, a water bottle, 2 axes, dogs, Dad and me. The drought had been a long one. All the currajongs and rosewoods had been lopped. The only scrub trees left were the currawongs to feed the hungry stock. I was young, keen, just left school with a need to prove my worth and skill. So I made a wager with my dad. I'll cut more scrub than you today from off this bloody hill. Dad just smiled and said, righto, mate, you're on, but with a cunning cheek hidden in his eyes. And I was young and that cunning look I failed to recognise. So we each grabbed an axe and chose our patch. And I said, we'll keep count as we go. And I began to cut like a boy possessed, what a count I'd had by Smoko. The currawongs were only young trees, yet hardy, droughty timber, and a few good blows would bring each down. And they grew thick in clumps upon the hill, tenuous yet tenacious in the dry and sandy ground. With back and shoulders straining and sweat raining from my brow, I kept count with every tree I fell till I yelled out, 50 I am now. 63, came the deadpan reply. Couldn't believe my ears. He's 13 up, the old bloke's ahead. That's the worst of all my fears. I renewed my grip upon the axe. This was going to be harder than I supposed. I'd have to up my rate and cut like mad if this gap was to be closed. A while later, in a lather of sweat, I yelled out, 75! The deadpan reply was 91, as he casually waved the flies. He's drawing away. It was hard to believe the gap was now even more. He's 16 ahead. I've busted myself and my hands were getting sore. I thought to myself, it must be technique. That must be the trick. Concentration might be the only way to beat my dad, the Axeman Mick. So with the concentration of a Buddhist monk, I meditated on each blow, making sure the axe would find its mark each time, and the faster I did go. In earnest I worked, sweat leaking from every pore as the scorching sun rose in the sky, and blisters swelled and burst their banks. as I screamed 125. A pause, like he was thinking. Then a sing-songy type reply. 145, he said, you got to try. Well, that was it. I'd had enough humiliation for one bloke. I headed to the water bottle and to tend my wounds and to roll myself a smoke. Well, Daddy soon joined me, sat down beside me and reached for his tin of ready rub, patted old Sal and poured a drink and watched the cattle eating scrub. Eyes fixed upon my boots and in a questioning voice I said, no matter how fast and hard I cut, you're always further ahead. With a chuckle, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, well, mate, I wasn't actually counting, Ro, but by jingoes, it's good for an old bloke to see a young bloke have a go. So that's just a bit of a funny story, but the backdrop is that we were pushed into a corner. Dad hadn't destocked, and so he ate all the grass off the paddock, thinking it's going to rain, We'll put our hands together, we'll pray for rain. Rain will come. It's never been this dry before. And it didn't bloody well rain. And the fodder got less and less, and we started taxing the trees, and we were up into the hills, taxing the biodiversity up in the hills as well. And through that whole period, it finally did rain, and we were able to keep most of the cattle. We kept most of them alive. They were skin and bone by the end of it. But nowhere on a spreadsheet did it turn up the loss of biodiversity, the loss of natural capital that went off that place. The dust storms, the topsoil that left, all that. No, the bank managers never talked about it. The accountants never talked about it. We didn't internalise it in any of our budgets. It was just an externality. Nature's always been an externality. Now, this is my personal story, but this was happening across the Australian landscape. And that's why we've got a legacy landscape that we're dealing with now, because of these financial pressures, the educational context and the cultural context of its time is still with us today. After that, we decided we'd become wheat cockies. We were graziers, and we thought there was a bit of a financial signal there. Wheat was worth a bit of money, and the whole cultural context was get big or get out. Buy a big tractor and go farming, and we're out the other side of Condobolin, pretty dry, marginal country. So we went about clearing some country. The bank manager was more than happy to lend us some money. There was tax breaks for clearing country at the time, big financial incentive to do this. So we sat on tractors and chains and dragged a heap of country, knocked a heap of timber over. As if that wasn't enough, we bought a 976 tractor and a Conochet 24-disc plough and ploughed these red sodic soils with already pretty low organic carbon and opened them up with a plough to let even more carbon escape. So we're, in essence, financially incentivised to decarbonise our landscape as fast as we possibly could. But our educational context was we didn't actually know, like, carbon dioxide is an invisible, clear, odourless gas. We didn't know it was disappearing from our soils. We didn't even do soil tests back then. So these signals that are out there in agriculture, this is historic signals, but they're still with us today out in the landscape, driving the decisions that farmers are making. And I think this is the context in which we've got to think about, is the signals that we're putting out. So fast forward a little bit further down the track, I went about 12 years on the farm like that until we just went, there's got to be a better way. I'm going to go and see if I can learn how we might be able to do this better. So I left the farm and I went to the Australian National University, best university in the universe. And I did an environmental science degree here. And the carbon dioxide levels had popped up to 366 parts per million when I received my degree. A few years later, 2012, I'm working as an agronomist out in the paddocks, and I went to a carbon conference in Dubbo, and I ran into this chap, Professor Peter McGee. The CO2 levels are 394 by that stage. So there's a bit of a trend here, I think. Peter was working on, he just finished a PhD, he was at the end of his career, about to retire, and he presented this raw data that hadn't even been published by this stage, working with this fungus that you could inoculate on. In this instance, he was working with clover and subclover. And this fungus he inoculated onto the subclover, grew it out for 13 weeks and got a 14% increase in soil organic carbon in this really short period of time. And it just absolutely blew me away. I became absolutely possessed by the idea, because working as an agronomist, I was looking for easy, simple, adoptable ways for farmers to adopt carbon sequestration ideas. I'd already educated myself about climate change, and I knew soil carbon provided some of the answers. And here might be a way for an easy entry technology for farmers to adopt easily to inoculate onto their seed and store carbon, and then maybe pique their interest in what else can I do to store carbon. So October 2015, the good old rockers AC/DC did a rock or bust tour around the US, which was one of the more important things that was happening on the planet. But 401 parts per million was my line in the sand. I was working as an agronomist and really worried about climate change, worried about how we could do something about it. Still remain so. And when it clicked over 400 parts per million, I'd been doing some work with Peter McGee out in the paddock with this fungus, trying to work out how it worked. And I decided that at that point, with 401 parts per million in the atmosphere, I'd better do something actually a bit more serious. So I started an organisation called SoilCQuest. I got a few growers together, my mates that were in the same thought patterns. What can we do about this? Some of my colleagues that were in the microbiology fields joined me so we put together a scientific advisory committee, and we had this rough and ready bush cobbled together scientific research institute. And we thought, right, well, now we've got an organisation, we go out and get funding for this research. It shouldn't take us too long. You know, in 6 months we should have heaps of funding because it's such a cracking idea. Well, how life goes, it's never that way. And but eventually, through I guess an intersection of serendipity, good luck, and a shitload of hard work, we had a bit of a breakthrough with some funding, which I'll get to in a minute. But in the seasons that followed putting that research institute together, this is my district, this is Forbes, so a lot of my growers are out there in that photograph. And 2016, 100-year flood. It took out a heap of country that usually didn't go under in Lachlan River floods. Flooded a heap of really good cropping country and a lot of my clients, but it filled up the soil profile. So 2017 had a full profile of moisture. We're going to grow some bin busters this year. It was going to be great. We got 60 frosts through winter. The average for Forbes is 8. We got 60 that year and right through that flowering period. So they're frosted wheat plants that don't yield. A massive amount of income lost that year, and it's really cruel because that's towards the money end of the season, and it just got completely nuked. Then the following year, 2018, that's the spring in Forbes. Usually that's the same shot of the flood. You can see Lake Cowell down the bottom there. That's what Forbes is supposed to be knee-high. It's supposed to be green and gold, like it's beautiful in springtime out in that country. And we couldn't even get a plant out of the ground. We couldn't even sow a seed and get it out of the ground in 2018. So in the 4th year running, 2019, this is the winter of 2019, there's a canola crop that should be up to your hip by now. And you can see a few green plants there that hardly struggled out of the ground, just as dry as a proverbial bat's bum. So there was 4 years and punctuated by some massive dust storms. I was in that one and it turned day to night. Millions and millions of tonnes and probably billions of dollars worth of soil heading over to New Zealand. Carbon dioxide levels at 411 parts per million by this stage. So those string of droughts, you think, oh yeah, they're pretty hard times for farmers. But you imagine being one of those farmers that have got to go back cap in hand to the bank manager and say, well, I want another $300,000, $400,000 to put my crop in this year. And we're going to roll the dice again. And the bank manager's sitting there going, holy smokes, what do I do here? Because they don't want to be the largest owners of land in Australia. They don't want everyone to foreclose. But I tell you, if it hadn't have rained at the end of the start of 2020, there were going to be so many keys on kitchen tables and people just walk off the farm. It was make or break year. And we did get rain this time, but it may not be next time. So there's some really serious challenges. We could have a mass evacuation of our brains trust of growers leave the industry with a run of really serious climate-related problems. And of course, up here, this is southeast Queensland, a picture I just got off the internet, but we're up to modern times now, March 2022, 419.5. And if I actually check today, it probably is 420 parts per million. So I don't know whether you cast your mind back to when I was born, it was 100 parts per million less in my lifetime, 100 parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased. I'm not quite sure what that means, but anyway. So hottest year record 2019. It has been getting hotter, and more heat drives the atmosphere around. As Walter mentioned earlier, we've got this hydrology cycle being driven around with extreme events, extreme hot, extreme dry, flood storms, and this is globally, this is what's happening. They're on the increase, and you can see back in 1965 when I was born, that's around about when the curve started to go up. So if we don't solve the climate change issue, it's pretty hard to imagine how we solve anything. So this at scale, at speed carbon sequestration event that we've got to orchestrate becomes a really, really serious thing for us to focus on. So the impediments to adoption become the critical thing, because most of agriculture is owned by private enterprise. So it's the power that makes those decisions is the power of the checkbook and the power of the real estate, as Charlie said, between the ears. And that's culture and that's education. So it's finance, culture, education is the key drivers, I think, anyway. I might be wrong, but that's how I see it. So we've been decarbonising the landscape and recarbonising the atmosphere, and obviously that's not working. And I just threw this in because it's a good picture. This is actually the soil up in Chinchilla from a mate that managed a farm up there. And the red one on the left is 100 years of agriculture, and the black one on the right is 1 metre over a fence line into native soil. So there's probably 5% organic carbon in that one and less than 1 in the red one. So that's 100 years of agriculture, decarbonising the landscape. Obviously, we want to decarbonise the atmosphere and recarbonise the landscape. Pretty straightforward observation. So the world's soils, we farm an area about the size of South America and graze an area roughly the size of Africa. So we have a massive footprint as humans. So that's a managed area by humans that how do we tap into that? It makes farmers and agriculture in general, there's about 2.3 billion people globally that are involved in agriculture as an industry. That makes that industry the world's largest climate army if we can work out how to plug it in. So that brings me back to this soil carbon fungi that I've been playing with for a few years now. This is what it actually looks like. So it's a bit like a mycorrhizal type fungi, but it's not mycorrhizal. It's part of a group called dark septate endophytes, and it makes a compound called melanin, which is a aromatic carbon rather than a linear carbon, which means it's more, its residence time is longer in the soil. It doesn't hydrolyse. So the two things that can break down carbon in soil, the two reactions are oxidation, so reactions with oxygen, or reactions with water, hydrolysis. In the case of aromatic carbons like melanin, it doesn't break down with water. So hydrolysis, the water, soil can get wet and it won't break the carbon down. It can get broken down by oxidation, but the fungi can actually deposit this carbon inside soil microaggregates that are anaerobic zones and keep it safe in the soil. So it's a really interesting way to take, and it's interesting having a look at that picture. Actually, the next one's probably just as good. That the treated one on the right versus the control on the left, the blackness you can see there is solidified carbon dioxide, like minutes through to hours, maybe a day or two leading up to that little plant's photosynthesizing and dumping sugars down into the root zone, and the fungus is turning it into a slow breakdown carbon, a more recalcitrant solid carbon. So he's actually literally turning a gas into a solid and keeping it there in the soil with residence times in excess of 100 years, up to 1,000 years for some of the mineral-associated organic carbon. So on the back of that, as I say, the intersection of some serendipitous events, a lot of hard trying and a lot of hard work and a hell of a lot of good luck. We put together an organisation that's called Loam. We're operate out of Orange, and we've also got an office over in Minneapolis with trials running all over Australia this year, and from Canada down to Texas through the corn soybean belt with research trials that we're in our 3rd year this year. So still non-commercial, but just doing a massive job on research. So, as I say, there's some serendipitous events and amazing things conspired to happen, and we put together a funding package from very, very climate-motivated investors from around the globe. Our first raise was $10 million for our seed round, and then our first round was $40 million. So a $50 million package to try to, that investors from around the world have thrown at this to try to get this up and going for a viable technology for carbon sequestration for farmers globally. Because our idea is at scale, at speed. How do we get it? Anything less is not worth talking about. We've got to do it at scale, at speed. Just a couple of Christmases ago, the team's grown to well over 50 now. So we jump in the lab. We do heaps of work in the lab identifying what fungi we've got. We throw them into the glass house, do a heap of replicated work. I'm going over time, aren't I?
Yeah, no, I'm going to stop you. Yep.
Right, yeah.
Okay, do you have anything? I'm just getting closer and closer. Is there one last thing you want to say? We can say for a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'll leave it there, I think. So we just test the carbon. We work with some very large growers in Australia trying to crack this nut. Thank you very much.
To finish with?
Oh, what do you want to hear?
Thank you so much, Guy. That was fantastic. And so open to questions. I had to cut him off so that we would have time for a few questions. I'm sure there are some, so please come down to the microphone. They have to be musical. Oh, no?
Not today.
Oh, okay.
Hi, that was great. You are talented musically. That could be really good. That could be a Carl Barron, a farming Carl Barron.
Actually, funny enough.
That's all right. That's all right. She doesn't have to come to the show.
That's right.
Okay, so considering that climate is plants managing thermal heat and water, right? That's what builds climate. So the climate is always changing. We leave this room and the climate will have changed. We go outside, it will have changed again. So what are the most constructive action strategies that we can do so that we can create the climate that we need to survive it? Because, you know, all of these things are so great, and I've heard so many great ideas today in general. But like you said, it's like, how do we turn it into action? Because we know we can replicate climate. We know we can do all of these things that need to be done, but how, and how do we get it done now?
I think you've got to look for a central metric of success. If you want adoption across the landscape, and particularly in the farmscapes with agriculture, you need to have some sort of measurement that tells you, are you winning or not? So regenerative agriculture in all its glory is hard to measure as a term. It's an umbrella name, and you know, I could buy a no-till machine. I was talking to someone today, you know, and I'd say, well, I've got a no-till machine, so does that make me regenerative? Who knows? You know, where's it start, where's it stop? But you need a central metric of success that potentially you could monetize, so you amplify up that signal of adoption. And that central metric of success is carbon, because if you're building carbon in the landscape, you know, life is based on carbon. So trees, shrubs, grass, microbes, animals, are all carbon. So if you're building carbon in a really common sense way, agroecological principles at play, and sensibly say, well, I'll put that row of trees there because it's a windbreak from a wheat paddock. I'm going to make it a bit wider because I want it as a biodiversity stand as well, and I want to count the carbon and get someone from the city to pay me for planting those trees, and I'll get these ecosystem services off the back of it. If you can measure the carbon and measure it economically enough and get the economic signal to the growers, and start changing the education and the culture along with it, then you get adoption at speed, at scale. That's my belief anyway.
Hi, great speech, entertainment, thank you. You showed 1983 drought photos. Charlie Massey had some earlier, and Matthew had some, you know, Mars or Benindi. So we've seen a bit of it today. Do you think if farmers denude their land like that now, that's not part of the climate solution, they should be fined?
Yeah, it's a carrot or the stick, isn't it? Quite often you'd rather the carrot. We'd all rather the carrot. The stick doesn't feel so good. But I think a bit of both is always probably the answer. And again, we're talking about at lunchtime, you know, what motivates people. And I think, you know, you could say that we're addicted to this way of agriculture. We're all on the train that's going this way. Industrial agriculture, how do you kick a habit? And, you know, one of the most hardest habits to kick in the world is cigarette smoking. Nicotine's a hugely addictive thing. And if you look at the data, what has brought those numbers back on people smoking, and giving up has been because the price signal it's been bloody dear to buy a packet of cigarettes, even with all the life unit ads and all those types of things that have gone on. The data shows that they didn't have a big impact on people. It was a financial signal. It was bloody dear to buy this pack of cigarettes, so bugger it, I'm going to do something else. And I think agriculture is the same. If you put a dirty, great big financial signal out there, that's what changes. You know, I've seen it in the industry. Like, people change enterprises on the back of market forces. And if we make carbon something that exists, not as an externality, but on the balance sheet, it's part of the profit loss of the enterprise, and you go to the bank manager and he can see it, or he and she can see it as well. And that's often the ghost in the room when you're talking to farmers. As many farmers in the room would know, the bank manager is always the ghost in the room. All this has got to go past the bank manager, and so it's got to make financial sense. And I think that's the signal you've got to send. So that's the carrot, isn't it? I guess is providing that big carrot, but you have got to couch it in the context of education and culture. And that's what I'm not seeing out there. Those three things aren't lining up out in the landscape at the moment. And that's why we haven't got adoption yet.
I think I'd rather walk down, but I think you're right. I mean, as you know, when you start looking at gross margins between Sorry.
Oh, you've been overruled. You have to walk down, apparently. Yes.
We can get someone to carry you down if you want.
You can tuck you down. You can.
Oh, he's fitter than what we thought.
All right. I thought I'd jog. Sorry, I'll just say, yeah, looking at gross margins, when you start looking at conventional systems and biological systems, a lot of the time the gross margins are better, but everyone's just fixed with the, more natural inputs and lower inputs. But everyone's just fixating on getting the best yields and the best quality, and and that's when they start looking at the financial money and cents, like I say, the costs of industrial just keep going up and up. So maybe there'll be a tipping point at some stage, but obviously, I mean, we see as a company too, like there's just more and more people each year looking at transitioning because they can see the current systems failing. The conventional systems are starting to fail.
People are starting to value resilience in their farming systems too, which obviously you're involved with. And I think that's got to be again put on the balance sheet there somewhere, that this might give us a little bit less yield, but in a really hard season, it's still going to be yielding something, rather than this chasing the highest yield ever. Like in the last 20 years, there's probably been 3 or 4 really, really high yielding years in my districts. And that doesn't work economically. Like, you've got to get a lot more than that. You've got to get the average up. And that's where building the resilience into the system, agroecological systems that have ecosystem services, to use the buzzwords, that's what builds resilience into your system.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, we're starting to see more people leave the traditional reseller models because it's all focused on contracts and corporate and profit, and they're starting to go out and consult now because in the more sustainable, because they're seeing their people come over. So it's really going to be interesting in the next 5 or 10 years to see how it evolves. Yeah,
definitely. Yep. Thanks.